Welcome. This is First Circuit Podcast number 51. Today, I'm back after being gone for ages. And we also have Biter.
Hello, everyone. And the person who's speaking earlier was Commander Lemming.
Yeah, that's me. And we also have Ian.
Greetings, everyone.
And we will be talking about... we have a lot to talk about with the No Guts, No Galaxy podcast that came out recently about balance, because it actually says a lot into what PGI is thinking. And then we also have just the usual general catch-up on the events that are going on, as usual.
Yep, so things to start us off, just to get out of the way. Black Lanner has come out for cbills. So if you want to spend billions to get that giant XL385 engine with not much pod space, you can now do so. I mean, I personally am quite a fan of the Black Lanner, but I think it's a very tricky mech to actually use. It's not the easy button like all the other clan mechs. It's a 55-tonner that really wants to be like a 25-tonner. With a huge engine and mask. And no space for any actual weaponry. If anyone actually does want to pick it up, I would suggest you probably play into the 10% range quirks. The Prime with its ECM also goes quite nicely. It's not a mech that really wants to brawl. It's a bit too clumsy and it's a bit too big to actually fight close up. You fall apart very quickly. So use that 10% range with laser vomit or some, lock-on missiles and the like, and it does all right. And I guess also the Sun Spider's out for MC, but who cares about MC prices?
Yeah. Well, here's the part where I usually say who cares about MC prices, but this time we've got something special for MC. The special heroes are finally out for MC. The Sun Spider Vanguard and the Rokne Powerhouse. So in case you missed the special day last year, I think, where you got both of them for free, now you can actually pay money to get them, or get more of them. If someone would really want to do that. I don't know. I guess the Powerhouse is quite nice, but eh.
I mean, throw down you still some wait. Fat MC for those Sun Spiders, man.
Yeah.
Well, you wait until the heroes are actually on sale.
Yeah. Can't you get a direwolf for 6,000 MC?
Something like that. I remember at least Annihilated Hero, it's 5,000 MC or something like that.
Yeah. Well, I guess that sounds about as an expensive mech.
Yeah. Otherwise, talking of sales, there's the Blood Right Clan content sale, which is a whole bunch of clan packs from the Kodiak to the Piranha are off for 30% off. If you really haven't picked up these mechs mostly, but they're all out for cbills, aren't they? I think. Other than, is there a hero package here? No, all cbill.
Yeah.
Okay. And otherwise, faction patterns are 50% off, one shot and permanent, along with the decals. So really, the biggest thing people mentioned is just ooh, I really like the Jade Falcon pattern or whatever. They can get those for a lot cheaper now.
Well, maybe one thing about this with the sale going on, if you picked up a standard pack and were interested in getting the hero is 30% off as well. So yeah, that may be interesting for some people. If you really wanted the Death Strike, you can now get the Death Strike and the Mech Bay for $10.50. And we'll talk about why you shouldn't get a Death Strike later on.
Carrying on with the theme of clans, there's a Clan of Faction Warfare event where you have clans versus clans. Clan Jade Falcon versus Clan.
Biter, I need to channel my Oldbob. Oh my god, lore! Okay, carry on.
It's just like the Inner Sphere event. I think, they're trying to rejuvenate faction warfare all of a sudden again. And they're like, oh, right, yeah, we should actually do events for it. And it's pretty much the same format as last time. 5 or 6 different challenges each day. You can get about 300 MC each time. And it's themed around different game mode each day. I still, even though it's a lot of MC, was just not interested in faction warfare when I couldn't do it in scouting, and that was still somewhat the case. But at least this time they announced it a couple of days in advance rather than 20 minutes before it started.
Yay!
Oh, you can't do it in scouting?
No.
You can earn some of the stuff, like if they do, say, get 500 damage. But the things that require MC are typically tied to, doing so much on conquest, to do so much on assault, etc., etc. So, the MC, which is the thing I want the most, I can't earn in scouting.
That's upsetting. Okay. It's interesting. Now there's, I know I don't want to be this brutal and say that we have 2 dead game modes in MWO. Solaris, I came back to see how Solaris was doing out of my big 2-3 month hiatus now. And I fought the same 2 people over and over and over again.
Oh wow, 2 people.
Yeah, you said
And,
you actually found 2 different people? That's more than I found.
That's pretty bad.
It just felt really bad.
They renamed the whole game to MWO Solaris 7. No one's playing the Solaris 7.
Well, yeah, I get on and I jump in Stalker, right? And the Annihilator counters the Stalker pretty hard. And there's a dude in an Annihilator, and I just lose to him every time because, I just like piloting the same mech. And then there's another dude in there who's in an Atlas, and the Stalker, when played right, counters the Atlas really hard. And so I just had a 50-50 shot of winning. I was like, well, this is different from launch day.
Poor Atlas guy. I feel like he just plays to lose. He's just helping out you guys pad out your win-loss ratios.
So, yeah, that's a sidetrack, but still, it's...
Yeah.
The extraneous game modes, they put a lot of effort into them, and they have so much potential, but how small the community is, sometimes it just doesn't feel good.
So many buckets, adding 40 new buckets to the game. As I said last podcast, it's just, it's spreading the community too thin. And most of the people who stuck around for MWO, they're doing it because they play with a group. They like the group play. They're not in it for, 1v1s or even just 2v2s.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. They are testing the waters of faction warfare. They don't really have any ideas of how to rejuvenate it, but they're trying to think up of some. But,
yeah, remember when they almost closed faction warfare for a little bit and everybody freaked out? Oh yeah. Oh man. Those 10 people that play faction warfare regularly, they're really upset.
Yeah,
Better pull that back.
I guess again you can earn some fairly easy MC here, and if you got the tournament supporter pack, that's a lot of stables you can get in addition to that.
Yep.
And I mean, it's some PGI is showing an effort to actually do something lore-wise, but then again, they miss an opportunity here. If they went for Jade Falcon versus Wolf, why not just do the big trial of grievance between Jade Falcons and Wolf, and put actual lore in there? But whatever.
Yeah,
at this point.
Chris is the side. I do like that they're doing clan versus clan and inner sphere versus inner sphere because people ask for that quite often.
Yeah.
I have a feeling, at least given how spur of the moment the inner sphere thing was, it was just that, they decided in offices, okay, next things we're going to work on is faction warfare. And someone said, oh, we haven't done a faction warfare event in a while. And they said, oh, hey, whoever does the event things, throw together a thing for us. And, this is it feels very spare at the moment, and they'll probably come up with some stuff later on. All right, and the last piece of random news is there's a random hotfix scheduled for 13th of August. What was this? Address a possible fix where sometimes the HUD displays inaccurate information regarding conquest capture point status. Oh yeah, that was if you've died in the match and you're spectating someone else. There was often that glitch where it would, it just tell you wrong information on all the on loss of the on the capture points. It would tell you ones that have been captured are actually neutral or in enemy hands, etc., etc. And so you get very confusing callouts from your teammates. It's like, "Hey, where are you leaving that capture point? You haven't flipped it yet." It's like, "It's full blue. I've done it."
And there were some weird situations where it'd say an enemy was capturing something. Oh, that was the most frustrating thing when I used to drop call.
Yeah.
And it would say that the enemy was capturing a point that we had on our side and I was dead. Like, everybody go to Theta, they're capping it. And there's no one there. It felt really bad.
I actually remember that bug, but that was ages ago. Like, I'm surprised they even bothered fixing it at this point.
It's been around for quite some time. It's so weird that it comes up in a hotfix of all things. And it's a hotfix, like when they do hotfixes, they say, oh, sorry, in 2 hours we've got to do this thing because it's screwing over competitive. But this one, they could have rolled it in the next patch, but no, they need to do a separate announcement for it.
And even more interesting, it's on a Monday. I think that's the first hotfix we've seen on a Monday.
Yeah.
So, interesting.
Well, at least finally there'll be a lot less of those confusing situations where, if I'm trying to shot call for my teammates, I'm like, could you please tell me what the capture points are? I just need to make sure that my information is correct.
A lot less spastic backseat piloting and panic over.
Yes. No, that was also part of the fun where you would have an argument with people where they don't realize that it's bugged up to hell. Guys, we're gonna lose. No. The score at the top is wrong. Only trust the word of people who are alive. And then I'm alive, so I give them fake news, and then they're just no. Pandemonium ensues. All right. So let's move on though to the big topic for this week. No Guts, No Galaxy had a podcast with Chris and Paul, two balance guys from PGI. About, well, all the balancy stuff that's been going on lately.
Yeah, and they hit a lot of really hot topics with the community. Let's say, specifically, I guess we can just start off with the wonder that is Lerms right now.
Oh boy, so PGA has been buffing Lerms for a while. They've improved the velocity, they vastly improved the ammo count, and they improved the heat of all the LRM weapons, which is mostly just quality of life improvements. In this podcast, though, they did give us some more tidbits of information, like they are planning to change the lock-on mechanics for LRMs, make it lock on much faster. But the how close your reticle has to be to the enemy to actually acquire locks will be approximately about 50% smaller. So you have to actually keep your reticle much closer to the target, but you will be able to lock onto it much faster.
Yeah, and honestly, I really appreciate this approach because Lerms are an awkward situation. I agreed, this is big. I agreed with a lot of things they said on the podcast when it came to Lerms, that there's a point where you can't really please people with indirect fire weapons, because it never feels good to die to someone all the way across the map, just kind of mashing buttons. And I like their approach of making it seem a lot less like the person is just mashing buttons, making it more difficult to actually use these long-range missiles. And because, of course, in the actual competitive scene, direct fire is just, it's always going to be the best. And now that AMS is, like, there are lots of rewards for actually carrying AMS.
Just by the by, Lemming, do you know what they did with the last iteration of competitive?
What?
It's stock only.
What the fuck?
Yeah, stock mechs only of 3039 tech. So it's all old AIS mechs. There's no clan mechs at all. There's no MRMs. There's no racks. It's just the good old classic kind of Centurion AC-10, LRM-10, couple medium lasers type setups with stock armor.
Is this what's going on in the
In competitive right now? Yes.
MR? I can't remember what they're called. Yeah, that's funny.
Today,
No, but I mean,
Commander
okay,
Lemming
say at a
catches up on the
higher
game.
skill level. At
Yeah,
a
there's
higher
still
skill
going to
level,
be. There's
direct
still going.
fire
Yeah.
and pinpoint damage are just often inherently better because you can't counter lasers by sitting under a roof. I think buffing Lerms is okay, and I'm going to get flack for that from some people, but that's fine. It's as long as they can be turned into a respectable weapon to use, so that you can't just program a bot with a macro to use them.
Okay, so on the lock-on change, it's a very interesting one in my mind, and I'm in two minds about it because you have to keep in mind that PGI they're not too smart with their lock-on mechanic, at least since that lock-on mechanic works for all lock-on weapons. So this affects streaks, this affects ATMs, this affects LRMs. So changing the lock-on mechanics means all of these lock-on weapons.
No, I thought it was
are affected by that.
specifically for LRMs. I didn't.
No, there's only one, sort of reticle that locks on, regardless of what combination of weapons you have locked on. And there's still, of course, the funny bug where, let's say you're only taking ATMs or streaks. If you equip Artemis, you get the upgrade of 25% faster lock-ons because you have Artemis, even though you aren't actually paying any tons or slots for those Artemis, things attached to your SRMs or LRMs.
Huh.
That's just a feature.
So changing a lock-on mechanic like this will affect all of them, but making them all of them more skill dependent is I still kind of like that approach. The question, of course, though, is just how easy it is to keep track of targets and how much faster are the lock-ons, because there is currently a balance, at least with smaller mechs. You are able to, with LRMs, hold your lock on them, but it takes a while to actually acquire the target because they're smaller. Whereas bigger targets, you lock onto them much faster. But if you cut that time in half, let's just say, it means lights and mediums actually have a lot less purview to quickly move around the map, because lock-on mechs can actually, if they can aim, lock onto them really quickly.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate for everybody to learn the light mech matches.
Yeah, if it's like a flea right next to the LRM boat skittering around really fast, and it's really hard to keep your lock on them, I imagine they'll be slightly more safe. But for the most part, when you're LRMing, it's someone at 300, 500 meters, whatever, and those smaller mechs might just get absolutely hammered, and smaller mechs in this game are already in a kind of bad spot. And if PGI keeps trying to make LRMs and lock-on weapons more viable, making them even more effective could be really painful. It also, of course, affects ECM mechanics. ECM increases lock-on times by 50% or something like that. So if it took you 10 seconds to hit that, light mech at long distance under ECM, it will now take you 15 seconds, something like that. I forget. It basically like doubles your lock-on times. If your lock-on time though is 1 second, it really isn't that annoying to just hold the tag on the target who's under an ECM bubble, and for 2 seconds rather than 1 second. So that could also be enough to ECM mechanics.
Yeah, it's interesting if these are percentage increases to lock time, like tag and narc, then I guess that inherently would be a nerf to them, because you're actually getting less value out of that percentage with the smaller number.
Tag, for example, improves lock-on times by 50%. I don't think Narc improves lock-on times, but yeah, Tag certainly does. And yeah, other than cutting through ECM, there wouldn't be much point in taking Tag. So, I mean, this is a whole kettle of fish. The thing with lock-on weapons is there's so many interweaving different mechanics, and if you change how lock-ons work, you affect how all of the lock-on weapons work and how overall the whole balance is changes in the game. Because if at least for me, as someone who likes using a streak boat, I mean, okay, I have to aim a little bit more, but it will mean I'll lock onto those light mechs really quickly, which means my anti-light mech weapon, could absolutely crush light mechs like never before, as long as I can hold the reticule on them long enough.
And here's something you actually just mentioned, which goes neatly into my point with it's gonna require slightly better aim in order to lock on onto light mechs.
Mhm.
So there's still a small number of people who are really committed to the Mechwarrior immersion, who play with joystick and similar stuff. Heck, there are even some people who play with controllers, which
What
like
kind of
the
weirdo would do that?
Yeah, the Xbox controller, like whoever.
There's some
kind of
people
weirdos
with
do that.
trackball mice still living the dream.
But here's the thing: those things inherently aim a lot worse than mouse aim, and that's something I've been fighting with for since forever in Mechwarrior Online, since this game is specifically optimized for mouse, given that it's based on CryEngine, which never really supported joystick anyway. So by making lock-on weapons harder for people who can't really aim well, you immediately drive away people who still use controllers, who still use joysticks, because until now, for me especially, I've noticed that LRM streaks, those are really easy to use with joystick. I don't need good aim to use them, I just need good positioning, good piloting, and that stuff I can do with a joystick. But if I suddenly am required to perfectly aim my streaks in order to actually hit the enemy, that's gonna be an issue. At that point, I'm driven even more toward the cluster weapons like SRM and LBX. So,
Yeah, it changes the whole design space
Yeah.
of the whole game with all these changes to LRMs. And something Commander Lemming mentioned, and this is part a thing that mentioned in the podcast, was they said LRMs are often not picked; they're also often maligned by players, and they want to. The reasoning for all these LRM changes is they want to make them basically like a viable choice. They want to make it so that higher levels, or at least there's a wider range of people who, when they're looking in their mech lab, will actually pick up an LRM weapon, and when they take it into the game, they won't be mocked derisively for doing so.
Yeah. The buffs to the weapon are to make them viable, and then now the changes to the mechanics are to make them respectable by the community.
Yeah.
That is a deal. It's sad we don't have Old Bob to talk about it, but he sometimes gets the brunt of it when he brings in Lerms and someone. Oh, it's bad. People get some shit for doing that.
So the funny thing I would say, at least, is LRMs were already quite viable if played correctly. I've had a lot of fun with LRM mechs, and I usually, personally at least, I combine them with Narc. But the bigger thing is always just you stick with the team, you push up, you use them at closer ranges where you have faster lock-ons, you're safe with the team, you're sharing armor, and you basically shoot over your friends' heads at close range, suppressing the enemy. And in those situations, it's not necessarily the most pitch perfect, damage per ton per second weapon, but it has a great effect on the battlefield.
It's fun. It's really fun.
Yeah, it's lots of fun, and particularly in group queues, even before all of these buffs, we would take whole Lerm teams and absolutely stomp the competition. So in terms of making it viable, it was already mostly a viable weapon. The biggest issues were just how strong you could counter it, i.e. it has like that minimum range, it can't hit people behind cover, it has time, it takes time to lock, and all of those things, like most of the block on weapons like streaks, for example, they're often maligned not just because you lock on and it does the job for you, but because it's not immediate. People really like, you see the enemy, you look at them, you press the button, and they immediately get hurt with lasers, for example. With LRMs, though, you have to press R, you wait for the lock-on thing, then you press the button. It doesn't feel as good. Now, improving the lock-on times certainly is going to at least make LRMs feel better, but I think people are still not going to be happy about auto-aiming weapons that do all the job for them.
Well, the other thing is also FaceTime, especially.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the biggest things that people complain about in terms of viability. If you have to stare at someone with any weapon, people are going to be upset. And PGI, this was interesting to me. They specifically mentioned in the podcast, or they spoke of duration increases to some of the laser vomit clan mechs as a nerf. They didn't think it was a nerf, but
I think Sean didn't think it was much of a nerf.
One of them there didn't think it was a nerf because
so.
they thought that it was like more. it was more heat efficiency when you have longer
it's
durations.
Somewhat. There is logic to. I did like Sean in this podcast because he is actually quite correct in the sense that. Whilst it does spread the damage out over time, it does improve your average heat per second. It makes the mech more manageable over time if you increase the duration, if you just increase the duration of weapons.
Yeah, but it's just FaceTime can really murder some of the mechs, especially with poor hitboxes. Thinking of stuff like like the Ebon Jaguar. If you try to laser boat in an Ebon Jag and you have to face tank more, that CT is so easy to hit, or even a side torso. That can just be a really unfortunate thing for a mech.
So, at least to me, their justifications of, we want to make it sure that this weapon that is often not used is used more. And I'm like, well, actually, in almost every game, if not every other game, there's often that LRM boat. Every team seems to have that LRM boat.
Yeah.
It's not like the weapon is non-existent in the game. There's plenty of other weapon systems that do not see much play. And ironically, at least to improve the prevalence of LRMs, what are they doing? They're nerfing narcs. And that is a weapon system I would say I see on average a lot less than LRMs. So, it's like, we're trying to make this thing, that is actually seeing a fair amount of play, see more play, whereas this weapon that sees almost no play, even less play. It doesn't seem, at least on that level, too consistent. And then, even when they're trying to make LRMs a viable choice, the reduction on lock-ons, I think, will most likely hurt the smaller mechs the most, because you locked on really quickly onto big mechs anyway. So it's just pushing the meta towards bigger, heavier mechs. It's pushing people towards using ECM, and they're also pushing people away from using NARC when NARC already is hardly used in the first place. And funnily enough, even though they're trying to improve the viability of NARCs, they're buffing ECM by making the bubble probably larger. At least they say in the podcast they're planning to change ECM as mechanics, make it less like a personal stealth and make it more of a team play bubble type thing. So it's like, okay, you make LRM slightly more viable, but then you buff ECM to just cut out. One of the stronger counters to LRMs is if a whole bunch of the enemy team have ECM, they just can't get the locks, or at least normally they can't get the locks.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So it doesn't seem like I think they're a bit out of touch, at least in the sense of it being viable. There are certainly ways that it can be quite viable, even if you're in tier 1, if you're a more competent player. you need to use it the correct way. Like I've used LRM a fair amount of times, but I used it on the front line. In fact, I would push the LRM mech, and nobody complains about that LRM mech hiding in the back when you're the one, fighting on the front lines with them. They just see it as another person shooting at the enemy, really. And they're trying to increase its viability, but they're making it more difficult for the people who actually use LRMs, which are those who aren't very, competent. They're also the ones who, maybe like as Ian mentions, are using game pads, joysticks, who struggle with aiming. Well, this weapon system isn't even useful for them anymore. And even if they try to get locks now, they've buffed ECMs so that you have its deleterious effects a lot more commonly. And even if there were people who are trying to support you like a Narc Raven, they're going to double the time it takes until you fire the next Narc. From 3.5 seconds to 7 seconds, so doubling the cooldown. So you really don't want to put a Narc launcher on your mechs anymore, or at least it makes it a lot more annoying a weapon system to use.
I've noticed this in the past. They don't like to have one independent variable when they make changes. So they can't see the effects of something that, at least from a development perspective, that would be a nightmare to try to see what is actually causing an increase or decrease in viability when you change everything to do with the weapon system.
Yeah, they're filling with all the values of LRMs. They're changing all the mechanics, like they're changing the mechanics for all of the missile weapons. They are nerfing Narc and they're buffing ECM all at the same time, as well as possibly pulling back Clan Laser Vomit and reducing Inner Sphere survivability quirks like the incredibly tanky catapult.
Yeah.
It just feels a little all over the place in their approach, and it doesn't seem like they have a greater handle, at least in my mind. I like the buff, the change to lock-on mechanics. It does make it more skill dependent. I don't think it will necessarily make LRM super viable, or it will necessarily make them more respectable. If you sit at the far back and aim at that tiny little dot in the distance, you're still not going to be loved by your team because you're not sharing armor and you're not being very effective.
Well, okay, if you do the same thing and say something like an ER large laser Raven, like you're still getting the same level of shit for doing something that bad, not helping your team whatsoever.
Yeah, you still get flack because of your playstyle.
That's not dependent on the weapon.
I mean, these weapons lend people to there's certain people in the game who like being the sniper, and there's also those who struggle with performing well in the game, so they do want to just sit back, snipe from a distance where they feel safer. There's a lot less risk. If it were me though, it's like if I really thought LRMs were not viable enough, even though I think they're actually in a fine spot, I would say, let's just reduce one of their main downsides. Let's reduce the minimum range, make it the same as ATMs. In fact, have no minimum range if you really want it. That way, you suddenly encourage people to get close with their LRM boats, and they don't feel like they have to, fall back on just 4 medium lasers or whatever. And people will feel like, oh wow, I'm bringing lerms, I'm bringing fire support, and even if they get close, I can splat them on my lerm. That sounds a way more attractive option to me, and I don't need to change the lock-on mechanics for all lock-on weapons. I don't need to change Narc. I don't need to change, all these bits and bobs. I just make LRM boats, a bit better up close.
Well, what is the minimum range down to now? Is it for Inner Sphere? Is it 180 still or 90?
Yes, it's still 180.
180 still, yeah. They haven't fiddled.
Yeah.
They haven't fiddled with the minimum range, but if you just change that to 150, you don't have to do huge jumps. I'm just saying, if you don't think LRMs are viable enough and you want people to take them more often, then just reduce one of their bigger downsides. Allow them to fight in close quarters. I mean, there is the issue that it's a long-range missile. What is it doing as a good brawling weapon? But honestly, at least it would be kind of hilarious to see, to not always assume an LRM boat is just easy pickings up close.
So that actually leads back to one of the first points I mentioned in the podcast, PTS. So with PTS, they specifically stated that they are overdoing some of the changes in order to just see what happens. And what Bida just suggested is definitely not an approach I personally would agree with, but it would be really interesting to see what happens. So why wouldn't they do a public test server for this particular idea just to give it a shot? And I feel like that's a missed chance here. And I definitely agree with the fact that they should try and change one thing at a time. And I mean, they have hotfixes. If necessary, roll them back 2 days after. But don't just try to change everything at once. There's no way whatsoever that this is going to give them any data they can use for future alignments and balancing. Like, this is...
Well,
Yeah.
it even got mentioned in the podcast by, I think, Sean, that 4v4 kind of sucks for getting data.
Yeah.
Yep.
it's
all, as I mentioned in previous podcasts, it's kind of more like a brawly mode. It's kind of like scouting, but with assault mechs.
Yeah.
So it's all about bringing the biggest tonnage to the table and the most brawly tonnage to the table, mostly. Like sniper mech, you don't have that long of a match to play if your 3 teammates get rolled by a Highlander with SRM24 and LB40. You don't have time to snipe. It's just best to go in and brawl, and that's why, at least for the PTSs, I just used MPLs. I didn't try sniping.
Yeah. You don't have the time to play like a long-term DPS poke build. It's just not possible.
But at least that is something that at least one of the people involved in the vocal feedback is aware of. Whereas there are some other things mentioned in the podcast that really had my hair go straight. One of the quotes I actually wrote down is something I think Paul said about it was Chris. We lean predominantly on people like Phil for feedback. And then 2 sentences later, Phil was like, okay, I've asked 2 people about how they feel about Clan Laser Vomit. And one of them said it was kinda OP, the other one said it was very much okay. And at that point, I'm kinda going like, Phil, you're alright? Do you actually play the game? Laser Vomit is definitely not okay. And if your response is 50%, yeah, Laser Vomit is okay, then maybe you should try a different method of getting feedback.
Yeah, I mean, if he's only referring to people like Phil and the No Guts No Galaxy crew, they often play, Mechwarrior Type mechs, which is possibly why they're looking at that Boogeyman, the 94 Alpha or whatever. But the thing is, like when I'm playing with more regular groups, we do LRM drops all the time, even before all of these buffs, because it was a great way to take average players and you get some people doing spotting and you turn them into good players. Relatively speaking, you're all forming around behind one gimmick, and it's all fairly easy to pull off and just absolutely stomp the enemy team. So when they're talking about, we feel like LRM was just a weapon that was never taken off the table in higher tiers, it's like, well, in some places, sure, if you're looking at those top of the line competitive teams who are always just looking to perfect their laser vomit and gaussing, then sure, they aren't experimenting, having fun with LRMs, but it just seems odd to me. It's like, this weapon's hardly ever used, but it's also a problem because it's being used with Narc. So we're going to nerf Narc because it's being unused and it is being used too effectively in this situation.
Yeah, it's, at this point, I somewhat understand PTO's approach here. What they said in the podcast is they don't like how LMs become so much more valuable when you combine it with Narc, Tech, Artemis, and T-Berg.
Yeah.
All of those factors combined. But nerving all of those individual factors does a lot of other things that they can't possibly anticipate. So, in my opinion, they should have tried something much more simple, like diminishing returns. If an enemy mech is already narked, why would you need an additional tag laser on it? Just take out the tag. Stuff like that.
But just a funny note, by the way, is at least the spread reduction you get from Narc is this. It crosses over with the spread reduction you have from Artemis. So if you're doing a drop deck where you've got some spotters narking and some lermers lerming. The lermers actually should just take regular LRMs. Their lock-ons are a little bit slower, but they aren't actually. There's no need to go for Artemis for the spread buff because they're already getting the spread buff from the narc launches. um, I don't know why they're going after Artemis in particular. Like Artemis on SRMs was quite badly nerfed already, and I sort of don't bother with Artemis on SRMs anymore. It's 1 ton and 1 slot for a minor buff.
Yeah.
Why bother? And with LRMs as well, we weren't even picking it in the first place with these, spotting teams. So, I don't care if you nerf Artemis, but it is a pity. I don't get it. It just they're talking about LRMs, but I think they don't have, at least within their own circles, many who do LRM comp drop, group drops, because these Artemis isn't the problem here. It's and even with narking, they talk about it in the way of, a narker can move up to the enemy team and then like narc all of them within a very short period of time. Yes, that's true, but that's not even the best way to narc targets. You saturate the field with things, and your average players, they don't know which ones can actually get shot, and they'll just, start spraying shots all over. The best way to narc is actually you get one guy who's out on his own in the open in the front lines, like the most important target, and everyone sees that one lock-on, and they all learn him. That's the way you turn your more mediocre players into good players, is you help them focus fire, because they shoot at the only visible target. So even with the 7-second cooldown, I won't actually be too badly affected by narc. It does mean misses hurt even more, which is always a problem with the feeling of viability for narc. But honestly, at least you narc one guy and the whole team learns him, he dies. 7 seconds later, you narc the next guy, your whole team learns him, he dies. You narc the next target.
Yeah, I think the narf, it was angled more at people who were actually not using narc for entirely LRM purposes. What you could effectively do is throw a narc on 6 people and know where half the enemy team is going at a certain point.
Yeah.
I feel like that's really, really useful in terms of like info warfare. Because it's not something you can purge or get rid of like a UAV. You're just stuck with that.
But again, that's still something that the double of the cooldown doesn't nerf. If you throw a narc on 6 different people, you're still gonna know where 6 different enemies are at all time. Yeah.
I think like the thing is, the info side of narc is often undervalued. It is usually only taken in full LRM teams where the narkers are being used as spotters, and in that case, you just need to narc each unfortunate fool one at a time, and you're good. I personally actually did like using narc for that very same purpose, limiting of infotech. It does have a lot of value there, though. Narking 6 people still doesn't necessarily have so much value, because you have to expose yourself to all 6 of them and pull off the shot successfully. Like, there's a lot of risk involved. Comparatively speaking, at least, you could just, get kind of close to the enemy and pop a UAV with, 40% extra range, and that thing will sit above the battlefield for ages, providing intel.
That's the thing, though, is that UAV, you can get rid of that. A narc, you know the locations of all these mechs. You know their damage states. You know their builds. That's really useful to me, in my opinion. I don't know.
Yeah, the narc keeps the location. It doesn't do their builds, I don't think. But
you can lock onto them, right?
Yeah, you can lock onto them, but it's not gathering the intel. Direct physical line of sight, I think, is the only thing that actually gathers intel on mechs. What I would say, though, is there is a way technically to stop. If someone is narked, where do you go? You go to your ECM friend, who has a larger bubble because the PGA has buffed it. And since the bubble has been buffed, and LRMs have become a lot more viable, possibly, everyone takes ECM mechs, so LRMs are off the table, and narcs are just doubly useless and not taken.
Okay, technical question, because I actually don't know about this one.
Mm-hmm.
When you narc someone who has ECM, right?
Yeah.
They cancel each other out, on that person.
It turns off the ECM, and it's a narc on them.
Okay, so it turns off the ECM so that allies don't benefit from it anymore.
It's like a very localized Beagle probe, and so they don't. It's not doing the bubble anymore.
Okay.
So if I narc 5 people, they all huddle right next to the Hellbringer. Hellbringer looks around very confused, and the narc hits them on the head, and then suddenly they're all revealed to my team.
Because that's the thought. That would be a use as well. You could just narc all of the ECM people and then leave.
Oh, that's when I'm spotting for my teams or whatnot. My prime targets are the ECM mechs because they're helping the enemy get the jump on my team, and they're prime targets for the LRM boats to take out first. So and as a narker, they're prime targets for me to narc. So you want to narc though. Narc is a good counter to ECM, and that will be needed if they're buffing ECM, but now they're nerfing it as well.
So, also, I want to switch gears a little bit because there was something I did want to talk about. This is one of the things that's actually been frustrating for me, and one of the reasons why I haven't played MW as much is the way that we're moving towards... Okay, so there's a dynamic in the game, right, where, at least in my opinion, where assaults kill heavies easy, usually, 9 times out of 10. There are exceptions for certain weird situations, but assaults kill heavies, heavies kill mediums because they're fast enough to keep up with mediums and they have way more damage. Mediums kill lights, and then lights kill assaults. You have a nice little food chain. That little happy food chain that gets eliminated by, effective team play and whatever, that counterplay is getting eliminated by this continuous movement that assaults need more agility and mobility and lights need less. Oh, I am so sick of it. And they brought it back up again, they said all assault mechs should be able to not get a full laser burn on a light mech, but at least hit every light mech, no matter what. And that upsets me on a deep level as both a light pilot and an assault pilot, because what's the point to team play then? What's the point to having a medium mech designated as a light hunter when you have these huge-ass assaults with huge alphas that are able to hit any light mech they want? What's the point? Like, where do we stop?
Yeah, I think the game's been going an odd way with regards to how all the different weight classes balance out, and this is something they've mentioned in the podcast that if you buff all the weapons, then the bigger mechs are able to take more of them. If you buff medium lasers, it isn't just helping smaller guys. The bigger guys can take a lot of medium lasers too. Whereas obviously things like heavy gauss and AC-20s, those are much more suited to the bigger guys. Overall, I would say on average, the game has been trending away from the littler guys, which is partly why you haven't been playing so much Lemming, and somewhat Larsh's group as well. Like we have a lot of people who like taking the smaller mechs, and the smaller mechs with engine desync do not have the agility to dance around heavier mechs and never get shot at. Like they can't, use their superior speed and agility to effectively win trades against bigger mechs, which means why not just take a bigger mech then? Why not just take a medium with a big gun on it and try and just snipe at people?
Which, by the way, is exactly what happened to me over the last couple months.
And in regards to these changes, there's some interesting things to note, of course. Making LRMs more viable helps the bigger guys, particularly if you're changing lock-on mechanics to make them much faster, which hurts predominantly little guys. So big guys, their LRMs are going to be more effective against littler guys. There's also Narc is getting nerfed. Now Narc isn't necessarily used very much, but it's often used, at least for me, I use it on small, light mechs and medium mechs. Mechs with more agility, so you can take interesting positions and hit the enemy with infotech, which helps your bigger guys do more work. Well, if they're nerfing they're nerfing the little guy's weapon, they're buffing the bigger guy's weapon, they're making the bigger guys hurt the little guys even faster than before. Like the little guys, that was one of their few reprieves, is that they were hard to lock onto. Well, now streaks, ATMs, LRMs, all of them love locking onto you after they change the the lock-on change. Like, it just, along with engine desync, lights have even less of a place. They have, they've had a lot less of a place than they used to. And so these changes to lock-on weapons, it becomes even harder because lock-on weapons, at least for the average player, are a much more reliable way to deal with the little guys. You can just quickly lock onto that locust who's running around and slowly, soften him up with Lerm. You put a huge ATM volley into him, or just delete him with streaks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, even then, okay, if you're a light mech, don't fight streak boats. Like that's
Yeah.
I don't feel like that even needs to be said.
Yeah.
But the part that's frustrating is when they look at 100-tonner, like an Annihilator that is designed to just be a huge front wall tank designed to fight other assaults and heavies, right? And frontline for everybody. And they say, you know what? That needs to be able to hit light mechs. What the fuck? Like, are we playing the same game? Is this?
Yeah.
That is.
Yeah, I mean, as it is right now, even though the lights can't effectively dance around the bigger guys still sort of struggle if the light mech is poking over a hill. Like, they struggle to get their fire back effectively on target. But game's ability to dance around assault mechs, bigger mechs, I don't see why that needs additional nerfs. It's already at a bad enough spot. You keep nerfing small lasers. You nerf small pulse lasers. You're nerfing these things. The most used by smaller mechs like light mechs, and you nerf their agility. Like the lights dancing around people game is mostly dead, other than the Piranha, and that's because it just has so much ridiculous machine gun firepower.
Yeah.
That it kills open mechs so quickly, it doesn't really need to dance around them so much.
So I think, I don't know, do we have anything else to mention when it comes to the podcast?
So
Couple more things,
there's a couple of things. They talked a fair bit about, of course, the laser vomit changes, like what they tried to do in the PTS and whatnot, and they haven't really come to anywhere for the most part with the PTS. I think. I'm still kind of confused a little bit by if we nerf clan lasers, then we have to nerf inner sphere survivability, and then there's a prime example they use the catapult.
in general, I'm not quite certain why I would specifically link the inner sphere survivability to clan laser vomit.
Yeah.
There's so many other things that warrant those inner sphere survivability buffs. Why specifically nerf them in combination with the clan lasers? That's kind of weird to me.
Well, the big deal that they were talking about was, okay, so why did grasshoppers and black knights fall out of the meta? And it was because you can basically do the same thing but better with clan mechs, because you have more agility and ability to poke around corners, and you can do just a lot more damage per second with poking. And the armor quirks are designed to try to make up for that. And because it fits into the nice little narrative of Inner Sphere are the thick boys that take all the damage and just run in and beat stuff up. And the clan mechs are the people who have to, be really careful and make good trades, but do a lot of damage at the same time. Glass cannon kind of deal.
Yeah, the clans have good burst, whereas the Inner Sphere have better DPS and are tankier.
The idea is that if they take the glass cannon ability away from some of the clan mechs, then the Inner Sphere mechs that will then be more equivalent to the clan mechs, like the Grasshopper and the Black Knight, might then make a big old comeback. And with their structure and armor quirks, that gives them an unfair advantage. But then they started making generalizations saying that, well, all Inner Sphere armor quirks would have to be involved. And that's where it starts to lose me.
Yeah, same. I completely understand if you nerf the Grasshopper and Blackjack. Those are perfectly fine, but stuff like the Orion, which for ages has now been known as one of the main tanks in this game. If you nerf the Orion tankiness, what really does the mech has left at this point?
Yeah. That's the other thing. At least their direction thus far, and they've already been doing nerfs to things like was it the Annihilator survivability? That's because the Annihilator had, when it came out, the top tier level survival quirks. So like you take the best survival quirks of the Atlas, put it on the Annihilator, which has better shape and better hard points. So it becomes an absolute beast in terms of tankiness. So what they've done is they said, okay, the Annihilator is outshining almost all the other assaults for the most part. We're going to dial back its survival because it actually has a good shape. And I'm like, that makes sense. We initially thought this thing would be so slow it needs all the survival, but it turns out its shape is nice and it's got good hard points. It doesn't need all that survival stuff. We're going to rein in the overperforming IS mechs because they have all the things going for them. They have good shape, good hard points, and good survivability. And the survivability is what's really helping them. Like, for example, the Innisphere Bushwhacker at least stands heads and shoulders above most of the other Innisphere 55 tonners because it A has a really good shape and it B has some of the best survival quirks of any medium mech. So it makes sense to nerf that. Whereas, if you're looking at the Wolverine, a mech that doesn't do so well, I mean, it's got fairly good survival quirks, but it gets called out a lot of the time. It hasn't got really good hard points, etc., etc. I don't see that there's so much justification for that. And linking it entirely with just, we're nerfing clan lasers, so we got to nerf the Wolverine or the Vindicator seems, a little silly if you ask me.
Yeah, and I can hope that they weren't aiming to just do that. I would be very upset if they're like, well, lasers are good now, so we better nerf the Kinjaro.
And then he talks about, I use the Catapult K2 a lot, and it's like, and a lot of people sort of raising their eyebrows at that example. And he said, I use the Catapult K2 a lot, and it survives, way longer than it should do. And a lot of us raise our eyebrows at that, sort of because the Catapult has a nice kind of head shape. It can sort of roll damage, but its arms aren't good for shielding. And its survival buffs are only like 5 to 8, maybe 10-ish on CT. 5 to 10 extra structure on all the components. That's it. It's not really a huge buff to its survival. And is this really the best prime example? I mean, the Roughneck, by contrast, has what is it? It's got double the extra structure and extra armor on top.
And you can tank with the arms.
Yeah, and the arms are way better at tanking. Now, I don't know how well either of these two variants are doing overall. Like, what's the average score? How well do they do when players take them out? But for the most part, I don't think the Catapult's an overperformer because of its survival quirks. And even if you nerf Clan Laser Vomit, I still think the Catapult is mostly a glass cannon, and it still would be. It just seems really out of touch to name his Catapult K2 as an example. If you roll damage well in any mech, even without survival quirks, your Hellbringer will last longer than you might expect. One other thing I was glad to hear about mentioned was they discussed at the end cool shots. The PGI Buns guys talked about, we're thinking about perhaps changing cool shots to be heat reduction over time rather than instantly reducing your heat. I think this is mostly good. It just depends on how much overtime are we talking about. Yeah. And you're still, in the end, getting that heat reduction and helping you to get more alphas out. It just means you have to be a bit more considered about it. So a bit like with the changes to adding recoil to Clan Gorse, it's something that makes it a little more hard to play, but in the end, as long as you know how to play, it doesn't change things at all.
It's interesting in terms of, how do I say it? Well, actually, it'd probably make it easier then because you wouldn't have to wait till the last second to use a cool shot. But
yeah,
it's interesting how consumables have seemed to become like non-negotiable at this point. You used to be able to really get away with it. It used to be that one try-hard guy that actually brought arty strikes into the match, at least when I first started playing this game.
Yeah. Slowly people have been moving towards the value of consumables.
Now, if you don't have consumables, then you're considered kind of a scrub.
Yeah.
I mean, my
and-
first advice to anyone, like, they're trying out a build, they say, wow, this is too hot, and they say, put in a cool shot. Put in a second cool shot. That's all you need to do to, help make builds a lot more viable. Just use more consumables in general.
Yeah. I don't know. It's just the thing. It puts pressure on people who don't have premium time and aren't making as many cbills per match as they probably would want to.
Yeah.
And it just adds to the horrible farming rate that this game has now with skill tree.
Yeah.
And I mean, it just doesn't, even though you can't tell it, it's not really, it doesn't feel too great if a mech that should really be hot isn't hot because they packed 2 cool shots.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel good losing 20% of your mech to a random strike that was just thrown randomly your team's direction. I just not a fan of the consumables at all. And as I've described before with a lot of these things, like I will give credit to Sean again. At least he doesn't focus on the large alpha strike. I don't know why PGI are so obsessed with like, oh no, you can fire like 12 PPCs at once and cook yourself to death. This isn't hot enough. The problem is they fired 12 PPCs. Yes, it's 12 PPCs, but it's a joke build. That's not really a problem. The problem is, at least with Clan Laser Vomit, is you take the Hellbringer and has like a 50, 60 alpha that it can do fairly consistently once you take all the skill tree. You got the maximum cool run, you've got the maximum heat gen, and you've got double cool shot. It's the sustained damage that you're able to pull out. And Sean does say this, that it used to be like 30 damage, but now you do 60 damage continuously, something like that. And I agree fully with him. The problem is laser weapons are supposed to be balanced by the amount of heat they generate. They're easy. They're rudimentarily easy to use. They're lightweight. They're small, but you should be able to pressure down a laser mech, but you can't because they've got 10% reduction to their heat gen and all this and that. But the bigger things on my mind is at least the cool shots. The cool shots are a big, huge safety blanket that make it a lot harder to pressure them down because they just throw away a bunch of heat whenever they feel at risk.
Yeah, and that doesn't feel good for weapons designed to be burst damage to be now consistent damage, because you have a button to just completely flush that weakness. Is sort of restating what you said, but
and Sean did actually ask, are you guys thinking about just removing it outright? To which they said, well, that's above my level to talk about, which I think somewhat is. I think it would be a huge change to the game if you're removing one of the big consumables. But I do think, at least in podcasts like this, I applaud Sean for bringing it up, and I hope in future PGI will actually be able to or willing to discuss it, because I think it's something that needs discussing.
Yeah, it would be similar to like taking a build that's designed to do continuous damage and suddenly giving it burst pinpoint damage, like adding a consumable into the game that makes it so that your next SRM wave only hits 1 point on the enemy mech. That would be
basically that your whack doubles its rate of fire for 2 seconds. Something like that.
It's, I mean, basically, at least for a lot of these clan mechs, it's somewhat like the next alpha you could do for free. Don't worry, it's fine. It's fine. You could do it.
Yeah. So whoever came up with the mana potion, that's actually really good picture there.
Oh, okay. All right. Is there any other things we want to discuss about the No Guts, No Galaxy balance podcast?
I think I'm good.
I mean, I basically have two things to wrap up my personal opinion of this. I think PGI is still listening to the wrong people, the vocal minority we've been seeing for so long, and I personally think PGI is completely out of touch with their own game. And that's a statement I'm gonna leave like that, and one I totally believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think LRMs needed to be touched for the reasons that they did, and a lot of these changes, like they aren't cutting straight to the jib. At least with laser weapons, it's all about heat, in my opinion, or maybe duration. And their nerfs were all over the place, just like with their ammo changes as well. They were all over the place. It does somewhat. I agree with Ian. In some ways, it feels a bit like they're out of touch with the game. It's like, oh, hey, racks have really good ammo. Let's give them even more. What's HMGs? HMGs are fine. We're not going to buff their ammo at all. And the changes to laser weapons, I mean, they've just sort of been floundering about. They don't seem to be fully on top of it. Their reasoning about survivability seems comparatively out of touch. The lock-on weapons, particularly like with LRMs, yeah, they don't seem to be coming from a position like. I don't think they even necessarily know how LRMs are supposed to be used. They sort of be thinking, oh, that guy who's sitting in the back, we need to make him viable. I'm not sure. It just, their rhetoric just does not connect to me. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and the problem is that the places that they're sourcing the information from, I mean, there are some people who can do some really good numbers out there, especially on the Reddit. There are some, I've changed my opinion somewhat on the Reddit. Like, usually, sometimes it's just a shit show, but other times, you know, you have people working on there who do these expansive spreadsheets that have lots to tell about the game. And there was that whole, back when I was still playing, they had that whole list of changes for all the weapons in the game. And I actually agreed with a lot of them. But then they turn around and they go, oh, we're listening to such and such on the forums, or, you know, some people threatened to refund their mech packs, so we really listened to them.
And they often, at least, they're making, it feels almost like an excuse of, we're only making specific changes. We're not looking at whole weapons changes. But things like the change to lock-on mechanics is not just affecting LRM guys. You're affecting all the lock-on weapons. You're affecting the balance of all the bigger and smaller mechs with this change. It isn't just, you know, a small little tweak to the heat of a medium laser. Changing lock-on mechanics is a big deal. So it just seems odd that you'll throw out suggestions like, oh, you know, make AC2 ammo just as good as AC10 ammo, so that AC2 feels a bit more viable, at least in quick play. But you know, then they'll do things like change these lock-on mechanics. It just feels, you know, completely like they don't, at least at the very basic level, it doesn't feel like they have a clear and properly thought out vision for the game. When I talk about, you know, laser weapons, I say they're lightweight and they should, you know, they're very effective at what they do. They're small, but they should be hot. And that would be my design philosophy around the game. You know, each different weapon group, weapon system should have its own role within the game, and it's mostly been designed that way. LRMs did not need to be fiddled around with. They already had their place as the only indirect weapon in the game, and it did its job fine. But they felt like, oh, it wasn't viable, it wasn't being picked, even though it was.
I mean, just because that's the tricky part, is just because it's being picked. Like, that doesn't always indicate that it's viable. Especially because LRMs used to be really the greatest thing on God's green earth in the lower tier.
I mean, for me, like I went in solo queue and do fairly well with my buy to learn boats. Now these things are abominations of the meta. Yes, Ian knows exactly what I'm talking about. So for the LRM Awesome, for example, it has 2 LRM-15s, a Narc, a Streak 6, a Tag, and 2 Flamers.
To the people listening, don't do this. Don't do it. Please don't.
This thing, on paper, according to most people's metrics, is one of the most least viable mechs you could possibly imagine. But I will pull 1K games with this damn thing because it spots for itself, it can brawl for itself, it can tank beautifully. I love this thing, and it's a pretty good example of how LURBs can be pretty viable on a large chassis, even though it makes absolutely, at least to most people, no sense.
All right. So I think that about covers everything from what's currently happening to the interesting. That's a good word for the No Guts No Galaxy podcast. But
it's all just them giving, I mean, it's just an informal-ish discussion, between the No Guts No Galaxy guys and the PGI people, and this is all the PGI people somewhat just responding to the questions, giving their thoughts on things. They're not necessarily going to be the most coherent on the spot, and these are all just ideas they have in their heads. Who knows how will actually pan out when they try and implement these changes in game, because it's always subject to community backlash and it completely flipping the meta or whatever, and them suddenly undoing it all later.
Yeah, I mean, it's none of the things they've said is concrete, but it's a good reflection into their perspective.
Except for the Tech-Narc Artemis nerf thingy, which I'm fairly certain they actually confirmed for the August patch, with Paul saying he's gonna have pictures in the patch notes, which should be, like, the patch notes should be already fairly done on their side, given that we are.
Well, I mean, they've changed patch notes after the patch notes have come out in the past, so we can't forget about that.
Well, they're going to give out the patch notes, and then they'll see how people react to these changes, and then we'll see what actually sticks. I do hope they. I hope they don't hurt Artemis. It's already in a bad spot as it is. And Narc, the only thing I want for Narc is for it to be properly rewarded, and that has never been implemented. That's the only thing I wish they would do. I'd be double the cooldown, but at least properly reward Narc for once, please.
All right, but that about sums all that up. So thank you for watching. This has been me, Commander Lemming, and then Biter,
Bark,
and Ian.
Goodbye, everyone.
And that concludes podcast number 51.